podcast. I am your host, Laura Donohue, and you can refer to me as she, her. And today I'm going to be talking with Steve Stops, he, him. Steve, thank you so much for agreeing to be on the podcast. Steve has shared a bio with me that I'm just going to go through right now. Steve is a founding member of Team Lumo, the multi-award winning mobile game collective. He has over 20 years of project management and product development experience, balancing technical innovation, artistic expression, and financial success. Steve now spends his time helping studios and publishers with production and commercial challenges while mentoring the next generation of creative leaders. Steve, thank you so much.
You're welcome. I'm sorry I made you read all of that out. Like I said, I have no idea how to describe myself, and that sounds really pretentious if I'd said it about myself. So it sounds better if you said it.
I think every bio sounds pretentious, whether we like it or not. I mean, probably don't like it very much. But but it's like quite impressive. I mean, if you've been around working for 20 plus years, you're going to have a pretty awesome bio. So
yeah, it's just a nice way of saying I'm old, right?
Yeah. Next topic. So this is a question that's I think I'm just going to start asking everybody that I host on the podcast, which is, what are your early gaming experiences like?
Wow. Just to reinforce the point of my age. So my first game experiences were Asteroids, Scramble, Space Invaders, Slot Machine arcade games.
Oh, a couple overlap with me. Asteroids and Space Invaders for sure.
Yeah. But I think I remember them. So, my earliest recollections of those games would be just having the slot machines in the local swimming baths, and they would just be there. Then we had like a small, rather seedy arcade in Brentwood where I live. It was like a tiny little shop unit where they'd squeezed in about 8 arcade units. I was probably about 8 or 9 when I was there, so my parents would be not keen on us going in there because it was dark and always looked a bit seedy from the outside. It was relatively safe on the inside, nothing bad happened. But so they're my earliest recollections. I remember going away when I was probably 10 on a summer camp, and they had a Scramble cocktail table machine, like the flat down ones.
Oh.
And that was the only arcade game they had, and I just remember putting all of the money I went with into it and getting good. That point, the first time when you get to know the levels, watching experienced players play and dropping down the mountain, dropping 2 bombs to hit the 2 little missiles before they launch. They're my early recollections.
Yeah, you start to really get the strategy then after repetition and watching other people play. I remember when I was at Sleepaway Camp, you're not allowed to have personal devices or anything like that, but I think there was a time when you could use a computer, and you better bet I optimized all those. Any time that I could get, going back to playing video games. Summer camp was a great time, but also I missed my games.
And the style of games, my list of anyone who knows me and has worked with me as a producer will list my 5 favourite games, because they're the only reference points I really use in every game I've ever worked with any team on ever. But one of my favourites is Ikaruga. Again, that same thing of memorising levels.
Oh, very cool, very cool. I don't think I've played that one or heard of that one before.
It's cool. It's like an old school Japanese bullet hell shooter. But the unique thing about it is you can flip your ship between red and blue, and there are blue bullets and red bullets. So if you're blue, you get hurt by red bullets, but you power up from blue bullets, and then you can flip, so you can use that as an extra mechanic. I've seen there was a video of a Japanese guy who completed the whole game without firing a single shot just by flipping the ship.
Incredible. That sounds so cool. What a cool way to literally flip the genre on its head and change the dynamic.
And I love that. When I say I've got a few reference points, that's what I like, is when people they've not tried to reinvent the wheel, they've come with something genuinely clever that changes the way you play a game.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really cool when you get to see a pretty well established genre, but then they just flip it a little bit and make something a little unique. So this episode kind of came together through a bit of luck, where I posted on LinkedIn, just asking people like, "Hey, who wants to talk about user experience, design, nerd out about data?" And then you just commented at it, which was very very kind, and we've had never spoken before then, and then had a chat before this. And so just thank you for answering my call into the ether. And I guess to kind of start out with maybe a bit more of a broad question, because we're here talking about data analytics. How have you used data in the various roles you've had in the games industry?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think in a lot of areas of the games industry, particularly free-to-play games, the use of data and analytics is like just standard now. But when I started in the games industry, it was not standard. My background before the games industry, like data and analytics has always made up a big part of what I do. And I, in my head, thought that when I joined the games industry, I was leaving that part of my experience behind and then moving into a more formal production project management side of the business. And that wasn't the case. Like, actually, when I first started, having not worked in the games industry, the first thing I did was spend 3 months looking at data around the industry to understand what was going on in the industry better. Because I joined a big work-for-hire studio, about 230 people, and I had, like, they didn't have a project for me when I first started, so they were like, we don't know what you're going to do. So in the 3 months I had before I got my first project, I basically read every retrospective of every game they'd ever made, because I had them all on file, so I read them all. And then I went and looked at all of the industry data I could. And that was my start. I think the thing with me, like as soon as I saw anyone saying, "Oh, anyone want to talk about data?" I'm a data nerd. Like it's part of my DNA. I use it in every facet of my life. When my train was late and I sent you a message and said I'll be 10 minutes late, I knew I'd be 10 minutes late because I'd kind of walked this distance before and I knew how long it would take me. You know, everything has these little markers and indicators. And so, having spent the first thing I did in the games industry using data, I don't think I've stopped doing that. Like as a producer, you're tracking, like effectively you're trying to understand how your project's going so you can see if you're ahead or behind and you can surface the important decisions and know what the most important thing the team can do is at any one time. Best way of doing that is tracking data.
And that brings up a really good point, because I think at least when I think of data analytics, I might think of, like web tracking and like using Hotjar or something, for example, seeing where people are kind of going on a site and then like tracking like exits and things like that, or, kind of seeing, what kind of actions people are taking in a game. But this is at like production level and seeing like levels of like productivity and like hitting targets and things like that. So it really goes beyond like the scope that I was thinking.
Well, you think about how numbers and why numbers were created. It was initially, like I would guess the early number is like 4. How many seasons are there in a year? There's spring, summer, autumn, winter, and people are using it to work out when do we plant stuff, when do we harvest stuff, and like the root of numbers is in trying to make our complex universe measurable so we poor feeble-minded humans can understand how it all works. And I think you take the complexity of a game project, it's to say, how do you understand when you've got 200 people in a team trying to make the same thing? How do you understand what's going on and how they're all working collaboratively and how the game's going to finish when it finishes? You don't have infinite money to make the game unless you're one of the huge studios. I used to work a small work-for-hire studio. We'd quote up front how long the game would cost to make. If you were a month over timeline, you would probably be about break even. If you were 2 months, you were making a loss. If you were 3 months, you were making a huge loss.
Wow.
So it's probably the most intense production environment I've ever worked in. So you need to be on it.
Right. Yeah, totally. And be able to like quickly understand like what the numbers are saying, and as well as a little bit down the line, like telling a story with it as well, and making sure that the conclusions that you're drawing, are backed up by the data, but is also well understood and implemented. as well.
Yeah, I think I've never had the luxury of having like a team of data scientists behind me, because I've always worked in a big studio but they didn't really have any concept of data. I've worked in Team Lumo where there were 4 of us when we started that up, a programmer, an artist, a designer and me, and so I picked up, because of my natural enjoyment of data, picked up the data. Or now I work at a publisher. We're a small publisher with 9 people in the company total, probably 10 people, and the digital team's 4 of us. And again, there's me, and I have a new data person who's better at data than me, so they get to do a lot of the cool stuff as well. But I think when you do it yourself, and you've got like a foot in the business side and a foot in the data side, you know that what you're doing has to be presented to other people. And I think data's amazing, and you can fall down the rabbit hole of looking into stuff, and it's easily done, but ultimately you have to then present findings for people. And with my production head, I always want to look at stuff that is usable. I don't want to look at data for data's sake. I want to look at data that's going to give me information that we can act on, that we can then make a change on. And so that's number 1. And then number 2 is, if you're working in a larger company, you then know you're going to have to bring people on board. Like a good example is a recent example where Sarah, new person coming in who's got a background in physics, she's doing a physics degree in her spare time, so she's got really good data skills, much more complex data skills than mine. When she first started, she's like, what can I look at? So, well, have a look at our sales data and answer a question about how long our sales duration should be. So she looked at all of our previous games and came back and said, if we on the Steam backend, you can randomly, your choice, you can do a 1 week sale, you can do a sale from any time from 1 day to 2 weeks. So the question is, what's the best duration of sale to maximise your revenue? She went away and came back and said, we're lucky, we've got loads of games that have been on sale, different discount periods for different periods of time. She looked at it, she looked at not just how much money we made while it was on sale, but how deep the trough was when it comes off sale, how long that lasts for. Came back and said 2 weeks. We always make more money when it goes in 2 weeks. Actually, it's 20% more revenue if we go on sale for 2 weeks rather than 1 week. So I didn't need to tell the directors, right, every time we do a sale, we're going to do it for 2 weeks. And they're like, are you sure? So I know that what I'm going to have to do is take them on a journey. I can't just present them with the findings.
Right.
I have to show them understandable points in the research to lead to the conclusion, so they can see how we've arrived at that. They can trust that we haven't just put a finger in the air. And like, it's the thing you find a lot. We're all guilty of it, where when something we find out is against what our gut feel is, it's hard. But if you learn to trust the process and trust the data, then you can make a decision. If someone just comes to you and says, just trust me, it's scary, particularly if their viewpoint's different from your own. But if you show them why you believe that, and you're prepared for people's counter-arguments and whatnot, like, yeah, but what happens in the weeks after the sale where it drops? Do we make less? Oh, we've already accounted for that. So how are we accounting for that? This is, you can then take people with you on the journey, and then they can understand why you're making a decision. Trust is in.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting, because you're right. It's not just kind of diving in, picking what you need, and then just showing like, okay, well, this is what it is, right? You need to explain the whole process of it and how we got here, and then the business impacts of that as well, and to kind of support your argument might be a little adversarial, but the point that you're trying to make,
It's a beautiful thing though. So when I first started at Excalibur, the publisher I'm working for now, data wasn't really part of the thing. They had some numbers they used to collect, but no one used to look at them. We used to have a weekly meeting where people used to read out the numbers, but I would ask after a while, after 2 weeks of attending, but why are you reading them out? Like, what are you learning? What does that number mean? I don't know. Like, is that high? Is that low?
Yeah.
I don't know. And it's like, so yeah. So I changed the numbers. I introduced a little graph that showed the last 7 weeks of data, so you could see, oh, this number's up on last week.
Time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Just to put it into context. But over time, other members of my team have started to adopt a data-driven approach. And I love it because I'll make a statement based on my own personal viewpoint in a meeting, and in the next meeting, someone will go, no, you're wrong, and here's why you're wrong, and here's what the data proves it. And I'm like, that's cool. Because ultimately, I don't...
The student has become the master.
But like, here's the weird thing, is in a business environment, I don't need to be right. I want us as a business to make the right decision for the games that we're looking after. So if I've said something that sparks someone to do some research that gives us a better answer that we can make better decisions on, I'm never going to be upset with that. Like, I'm upset if someone goes, you're wrong, why? Oh, just because. That's a useless thing. But when someone comes up and I've like argued with someone in a meeting, like not in an adversarial way, but in a, we're both trying. I trust my team. My team aren't trying to undermine me. They're not trying to prove me wrong. What they're trying to do is say, no, the decision you're about to make is wrong, here's why. And that's cool.
And that is a really beautiful thing. And because I think also maybe some misconceptions about data is that, oh, it's just a way to like catch someone out or to get someone in trouble, or people often like use numbers in an argumentative kind of way to, that the point is just to make a point. Whereas it sounds like the ethos that you've been able to like cultivate at Excalibur is a place where, okay, I'm here to show you guys how we can harness data in a way that's going to help everyone. And that everyone's like really adopted that, and that's very special.
It comes from a place of trust, though. I worked in toxic work environments where people are trying to move on in their career by stepping on other people. And then I've worked in collaborative work environments where people are just trying to get better at their job. Now, I believe the second one is a better way of moving on in your career as well, because if you get good at what you do, people will recognise that and reward that by you moving on in your career. Whereas, so you have to start by cultivating an area of trust, an area where you know that people aren't out to get you and they're not trying to stab you in the back, where actually everyone is trying to pull in the same direction. Like, I think the example you give is where people are trying to prove a point from their own perspective, rather than looking at it from a dialectic point of view of what's truly the best answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And just kind of going back a little bit, so when you were talking about one of your data scientists pulling the sales data and presenting like, okay, 2 weeks, that's kind of the best. Could you speak to the process of that? Like if someone, here was interested in, learning how can I use data to help understand my sales or something about my game, like what would that look like?
Yeah, so let me start with a simpler perspective that I understand better. And the only reason I will start with that is because Sarah uses more complicated maths than my brain will cope with to do that, because she's got experience in that. So let me start with, I'm an idiot. So I use data in a really simplistic way. My data tools in inverted commas, is basically Excel and SQL, and I only use SQL because I'm an old person and I started using it. Like if you look at Python and Pandas, like what you can do if you're much more programmatically minded is really powerful. I'm not. I don't have that skill set. I was lucky enough to use SQL in my job when I worked in the city about 4 lifetimes ago. And so I know SQL, and even now, if you asked me to write some SQL, I couldn't, but I know I could relearn it in about 3 days because my brain will go, I remember it. But in a simple term, let's use an example from one of my previous games, and then we'll roll through how that example goes. And I use basically the same simple statistics in everything I do because I can understand it. And the beautiful thing is if you do it in a simple way that you understand, there's a better chance you can explain it to other people and they might understand it as well, right? I've seen loads of people go, oh yeah, but you could use this much more complex method. You can use like chi-square to calculate the same thing. You can, yeah, but how am I going to explain that to someone?
Right. I mean, there's a difference between, is it okay to just use, a normal hammer or a sledgehammer, or you pick what you need, right? Yeah.
And I use Z-score for most of what I do, which is a really fundamental piece of statistics that forms a key role in hypothesis tests and everything else. But actually, at its fundamental level, it's a really simple thing. Mm-hmm. So we had a game. So when technically the 4th game released as Team Lumo, but the second game we released as an independent studio is Team Lumo, because we originally started as a Skunkworks studio in a larger company. The second game we released independently was a game called Lumo's Cat. And it's effectively a psychedelic tower defense game where you had a little cat, you needed to stay asleep, and these little mice would come in and try and wake the cat up, and your job was to defend the cat so the cat could stay asleep. And you could choose your own difficulty level by how much cheese you fed the cat before it went to sleep. So we had like variable difficulty level, and we had something like, maybe we had 10 different art styles for a level, and then we had 10 different difficulty levels for each level.
Okay.
For each. And so that mix meant we had hundreds of potential variants of level. One of the things we were wondering early on when we were watching how quickly our players were declining over time was, is the level of difficulty right for players? And that was a question that Jonathan, the designer, came to me. And so this is like what I like. When you're using data, it's really good to start from a place where you have a question. Rather than going, I want to look at data. Do you? Why? Like, it's really good to start with an actual fundamental question.
Absolutely. The same goes for research, or really anything else in life, that, you know, it is much more motivating as well to have some kind of end goal or question in mind, to have before kind of diving in, because then you're just kind of floating around aimlessly, not really sure where to go.
So, like, number one fundamental thing is the difficulty right in our game. So then the next question, the fun part for me, is to then go, okay, how can we look at the data and answer that question? And that's like the approach to everything we do. How do I look at the data to prove the question we've been asked to find out? And so we looked at a couple of stats. So the first thing we looked at is how many people had played each variation at each difficulty level of the game. And then we looked at how many people that was the last activity they did in the game. So what we would do is look at any player that hadn't played the game for 7 days or more, and we would call those players a lapsed player, and then we took all of those and looked at a subset of what was the very last level they played in the game. And then we could do a really simple calculation saying what percentage of people so 11,000 people played level 76. And how many of those that was 11, and then 1,000 of those was the actual number who played that as our last thing. That's about 9%. So you're like, okay, 9% of people played that. And then you take that across all of the levels, and then you can see what percentage of people have played each of those levels as the very last thing they did in the game. So let's say on average, across all of those, it's about 15% people play a level. That means 15% of people normally leave on a certain level. But let's say on one level, 20% people left. Mm-hmm. Well, that sounds like more. So that sounds like that's a level that people don't like.
Right.
So we built that table first of all. Then the next question is, how difficult is the level? And we did a similar thing where we said, well, let's say difficulty is how many times it takes someone to play a level before they successfully beat it. And we did the same. How many people will play each variation of the level? How many people, what's the average number of times people have played a level before they beat it? And the higher that number, then the harder the difficulty, the lower that number, the easier the difficulty.
Right.
And so that's really simple. And you could represent those as percentages, and you can compare one set of percentages against another, and it's perfectly valid to do that. In fact, when we first looked at it, we were like, okay, this is showing us some interesting things. And I think often that's like the first benchmark. The amount of times I throw data together and look at it and go, it's not really showing us anything interesting. Like imagine the number of people who played a certain level as their last level was always the same number.
Right.
You're like, well, that's just people just
well, this is perfectly balanced, and we've done it.
Yeah. Or the way we're looking at the data isn't finding
right, you might be
answer.
missing something.
Yeah. But one of those two things, right? It's not telling us anything interesting. So the percentages start to go, this is showing us something interesting. But what you don't know is like when a number is like 20% of players leave on this level versus 15%, is that statistically significant? Is that a meaningful piece of data? And so what Z-score does is it adds an extra layer on top of that. It doesn't just give you the number, it tells you how statistically significant something is. And it does that really simply. A Z-score uses mean average, standard deviation, and then a simple calculation between the two of those that applies to central limit theorem, which is a statistical theorem. So, if you're using Excel, you highlight the column of data, and you go mean average, and it gives you the mean average. And then you highlight the same column of data, and you use the standard deviation function, and it tells you the standard deviation. You don't need to do any fancy, clever mathematics. The standard deviation is on average, so let's say the number that appears most is 15% across all of those levels, and on average, it's either 13 or 17%. So my standard deviation at that point is 2, because the most that number shifts on average is 2% either way. So that means my max number is 17%, my minimum number is 13%, my number of 20% looks important based on that because it's much higher than the standard deviation. And then what statistical theory tells you in the central limit theory is if your data follows a standard bell curve, 97.7% of all data will fit within 2 standard deviations of the centre, either way. So that means if you've got anything that's more than 2 standard deviations away from centre, it's statistically important.
Yeah, something funky's going on.
Yeah, and the way you calculate it is really simple. You take your number, you deduct from that the average, so you're left with your number less the average. So let's say the average is 15, my number is 20, I deduct 15 from 20, I'm left with 5.
Right.
You then divide that by the standard deviation, which is 2, so that's 2.5 is my z-score, and that's telling me how many standard deviations away from that centre point my number is. And 2.5 is outside of the 2 standard deviations, so that's really statistically significant. That's like in the top 2.7% of deviation from that centre. So that's what z-score is. So you end up with a number that is most likely somewhere between 0 and 3, plus or minus, telling you if it's underrepresented or overrepresented. So once you've educated people into what z-score means, which takes about 2 minutes at the beginning of the meeting, and they understand that anything bigger than 2 is really statistically significant, then it becomes a really easy thing to do. And then I used to make these little graphs, I think I sent one to you, where what I'd have is the centre line represented, and if it's green, it's going to the positive, and if it's red, it's going to the negative, and if it's statistically significant, I would colour them green, and if it's anything less than 2 standard deviations, I just grade them out because you don't need to worry about them. So what people quickly get is like a little chart which had all the levels, and then the little green lines and little red lines on them, and you can quickly see which ones are overrepresented, underrepresented. And we did, the comparison we did is, we did that chart for difficulty, and we did that chart for likelihood of leaving a level. And we found there were 3 levels where they had really hard difficulty and a high likelihood of people leaving the game. And I remember when I presented my little thing to the designer, he looked through the chart, looked through how we made the difficulty on those levels. All 3 of them, he'd used exactly the same mechanic. What he'd done is he'd made the mouse health higher, so they were much harder, took much more energy to defeat. Whereas at other times he would use lots of mice to make it harder, but they were the same level of energy to defeat. So it felt like you felt really powerful because you were getting rid of these hordes of enemies, whereas this, you get a low number, but you felt frustrated. He immediately saw that and was like, oh, I know what I've done. And so we just took that type of difficulty out of the game. Interestingly, we could also see the kinds of difficulty players like, things where they had loads of attempts to finish a level, but a lower than statistical average of leaving the game at that point. So we could then use that to go, well, that's the difficulty players like, that's what they don't like, let's get rid of that and put in more of that.
And it's just such a fantastic way to, firstly, I remember you showed me that, and it was just so blaringly obvious, like, yes, this is the issue. And also something that didn't sound too difficult to fix. I imagine, you just change the
change the numbers back in. It literally took him 3 minutes to go in and change it because we could change all the different.
And something that was significantly impacting, drop off rate and things like that. And then also to be able to tell, because I think there's this battle might be overblowing it a bit, but like, there's a time for quantitative data or a time for, doing qualitative research. But actually, this is a really great example of, if you have the right questions and the access to that data, of getting part of that why, because it was very clear to see, like, well, just because someone fails a level a lot doesn't mean they don't enjoy it,
Yeah.
And so there are different types of difficulty. You were able to determine that there were different types of difficulty that were enjoyable and not enjoyable. And just very clearly able to use data to answer that why.
Yeah, I think one of my earliest days of being, so when I left a big studio, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I dabbled in doing mobile publishing on my own for a little while because I had some good contacts, I had some experience in helping games, and I found this really, from a local developer, a really beautiful puzzle game called Morphopolis that I fell in love with as soon as I saw it. One of the things I did is put it through a usability test with Usability Lab, and they flagged usability issues for the designer of the game, saying no, they're design choices. This is supposed to be a hard, like, point and click puzzle game, and it's a really fine balance sometimes between, is it deliberate usability issue,
right,
or is it a actual usability issue? And actually, like, in some instances, I would say the Usability Lab had it right, and actually what they've done is made it hard but frustrating. And other times, no, the Usability Lab had it wrong, because had they made it easier, it wouldn't have been as rewarding. And it's a really, like you say, that balance. This is why data is really good, because at the time as a designer in a Usability Lab, you're going on hunches. Once you go out into the world, you can then match the decisions you made to what you see in the data.
Absolutely, and it helps kind of, it's a really fine line between, having your vision and implementing that, and having it be received in the way that you want it to be, and simply because something is hard or difficult, or if it requires, there are a lot of different games, like The Witness, for example, where you just plop into a world trying to figure out these, like, progressively more difficult logic puzzles, where you just want to tear your hair out. But it feels so satisfying when you, like, figure it out and you're like, wow, that's really clever. And that's not like a usability issue at all. That is the way that, that person has fun and learning and feel like quite clever, which, it can be hard to feel like that in the real world sometimes. So, kind of like having, it's not necessarily you do usability testing to, like, make things easier. It's so that it is more, readily accessible for, your player to get stuck in and enjoy it in the way that it's intended.
Yeah, like, the data will show you what players are doing. It won't tell you how they're feeling and thinking and why they're doing it. And so sometimes the data can be really obvious. Like the example I gave is a really obvious example.
That did a really good job of saying, not exactly knowing, like, why they didn't like that level, but it was clear that mechanic just wasn't working out.
Yeah, and also, like, I have to give credit to Jonathan, the designer, because so few people are open to that. Like, so many people are like, yeah, but that's how I wanted it to be. Like, I want it, and it's like the fact that he can be open and go, oh, like, I want it to be hard. I don't want it to, like, be so hard. Because some people are like, I don't care if people leave the game. I want it to be this way. And I see that a lot in developers, and ultimately we want people to be playing and enjoying their games. I think if we get difficulty wrong, but I think, that's not allowing players to have the fun they should want to have in the game. There were some other lessons we learned more about that and we'll change later, but we could talk about that in a bit. But I think the other important bit is that sometimes that one's one where the data gave us everything we needed. Like, the other thing early on in the same game is, like, one of the simplest pieces of analytics I think everyone should be doing on their game is, if you've got some kind of tutorial or onboarding at the beginning of your game, you should tag the game to send an event every time someone gets to a step in that process. So you can see how many players start playing your game, how many players play first minute, first 10 minutes, first hour, so you've got a sense of when players are leaving your game. Like we saw really quickly in Lumo's Cat, we had something like, let's imagine we had 1,000 players start the game, 900 people make it through the first step of the tutorial, 800 to the next step, 700 to the next step, and 300 to the next step. When you suddenly see a drop like that, you're like, okay, something's going on there. And that's either players are bored with the game by that point and we've done a really bad job. They've realised what the game is and they've realised it's not for them and we've done a bad job of selling the game, or we've got a major problem in our tutorial. And like when we experienced that, that's when we would get really targeted usability and playtesting done to go, oh, that didn't come up when we did our playtest originally. Let's get some more playtests done, just focused on that one little section of the game and watch people so we can get an understanding of what they're doing in that point and why they're getting stuck. Something's going wrong.
Which again really helps, focus teams and figure out. Cause I did like a Ask Me Anything on the Game Dev local podcast, and people were like, "Oh, well, how do I kind of get started, or what does it mean to like measure like the user experience of the game? What should I focus on?" And so having that question and doing that preliminary, kind of groundwork, because you might not necessarily need to play test your whole game. And also get feedback on, you're working on the graphics or the audio isn't quite finished yet, or it's going to be totally different. So there's no need to get feedback on that. That's just going to be a waste of time because it's something that's, it's not ready for feedback. But being able to, tag these events, especially in a first time experience, and seeing like a huge drop off, you're like, okay, something interesting is going on here. This is where we need to focus our resources on. And maybe that means they need to play a little bit beforehand to see what happens afterwards, but then like what to focus on.
Yeah, and it's that, I think, the problem is if you're a small independent team, you don't have a load of budget. Like, if you're a huge multinational corporation spending like £10,000 per usability test and running 20 usability tests throughout the year, they don't do that, but they could afford to.
Yeah.
They don't, because none of them really understand the process well enough. But you could spend that. If you're a small indie team, you don't have £200,000.
Don't need to do that, sounds like.
But what you could do is you could go, I'm going to do a really small, really focused usability test just on the one bit I've now identified in place. And don't go to other game developers and ask them to play your game, because other game developers will just tell you all of the things you've done wrong because they just want to show off how smart they are and why they wouldn't have made the same game decisions. Don't just go down some local bar and wander up to strangers and say, play my game, because they're out having a nice time. You either need to engage a professional lab who know what they're doing if you can afford it, and budget for that if you can, or you need to find some people who are your target audience for the game and invite them to a little space to get them to play the game and watch them play. Don't ask them afterwards why they got stuck or anything. They will lie to you. Just physically sit and watch them play.
Yes.
And in an ideal world, what you will have done before you launched your game is had a proper usability test where you watch people in a professional lab environment play through your game. Because actually often when you see the data then makes you go, oh, do you remember when we saw that one person, but we didn't think it was a big deal because it was only one person out of the 9 people who played the game, so it wasn't statistically significant. But actually now we've got 1 million players, and that's now 100,000 people who are all having a problem with the game.
Yeah, that is kind of one of the difficulties with Quant. I mean, the great thing with Quant is, especially if you have a lot of players, that have consented to like having their data tracked and things, which remind me that we should talk about that at some point. But with qualitative research, because it takes so long, I mean, there's also like unmoderated testing that you can do as well, which can be incredibly cost effective. Unlike, I think like usertesting.com does that. But, oh God, I just lost my train of thought. Right, it takes a lot of time, money, and resources. And so if you're going to do it, you got to make sure to do it right. And then, right, this is what I was actually going to be saying was you can only do it with so many individuals. And so it is kind of hard to, say with 100% certainty, like, this is going to represent, like, your whole, audience of playing a game. But that's why, you run several of them. You have a really well thought out recruitment criteria. And even though it might not be like, so I came from kind of like an academic background as well in data, and came in and was like, we're only testing with 10 people, that's not going to be statistically significant. But actually, you'll be surprised if you have enough people, 10, 12 people playing your game, if you see the same problems coming up again and again, stats don't matter at that point. That is observed behavior, something that's happening, a pattern that's happening over time, and you can draw inferences from that are definitely going to be applicable, that even if you did test it with 1,000 people or whatever.
Oh, 100%. I think for most people, in the first usability test you run, you actually, with the first 3 people who test it, you basically face palm yourself on the second one and you go, this third one's going to validate it, and you just see the same, it's like, I always think of it as like an onion skin, where like you start with the first layer and you peel back the layers of the onion skin with your usability testing. And the first round, the layer's so big and so thick, it will be obvious to everyone. Everything you thought was easy and obvious for everyone to play isn't, and all of a sudden, and the things you think are going to come up aren't the thing.
Yeah.
There is these blindingly obvious things that you completely missed because you're too close to your own game. You watch the first person play it and you're like, this is my day now. For the rest of the day, I'm going to basically watch people have this same problem over and over again. And it's actually why when people say my game's not ready for usability testing, they're wrong. Like the amount of times when we've gone, when we add this effect to it, when we add this, it will make it obvious to people. So we keep layering stuff on. Then you usability test it, and you suddenly realise the fundamental mechanics wrong, and you just spend a month layering stuff on top of something that you could have just tested and realised was wrong and fixed it before you'd invested a month of time on it.
Absolutely, totally agree. And it's okay to kind of also warm up your participants to say, don't worry too much about the sound effects or the graphics, that's not final. What we're really interested in is understanding, do you know what's going on? How to use the tools at your disposal? Does it all make sense? And focus on that. And again, it's just making sure that you're optimizing the data that you're collecting and the feedback you're getting, just as you would do in a quantitative study. And I wanted to ask a little bit about, because I think some people might be a little worried about implementing tools that kind of track player behavior or actions and things like that, just in terms of privacy and data handling. What kind of advice would you give to someone who might be a little bit new, or a studio who, you've joined studios that weren't really, or had this data but weren't sure to use it, what kind of advice do you have?
Yeah, so just for complete transparency, I haven't done a lot of data stuff since COPA, so there's a whole world of stuff that I might not be aware of. But from a general perspective, my view has always been, I don't care about who this individual is. So all I need to know is when someone starts playing the game, I just need to create a unique ID that relates to that device. And I kind of write off the fact that most of my analytics comes from mobile, but I think this applies to mobile and PC. People could share the same device, and you could have 2 different players, and so that will skew your data. But actually, if you've got enough players, that's only going to be a tiny portion. It's not going to skew your data significantly. Most people will play a single game, play your game on a single device, and the data will be true for that person.
Yeah.
So if what you do is you can take some kind of device ID, and when your analytics will recognises that device ID, it then creates a unique identifier for that machine. And then all you're going to track, and use your choices really carefully in this, is effectively triggers of what happens in that game session. So all you're really doing, when you go onto your Apple device or something, it says, can we track data that lets us improve the performance for you? It's that kind of stuff.
Right.
So if someone said, is that person male or female? Where do they live? All of that kind of demographic data that marketing people might ask for, never tracked any of that. And back in the day, what you could have done is got people sign in using, say, their Facebook ID, and then downloaded the whole of their social graph, known everything about the person and all of that stuff. I don't care. I want to know about player behaviour across the people who play our game, and that's all I care about. So what I try and do is have no sense. There would be no way I'd be able to identify anything about that person. You don't need it for quantitative analysis on what people are doing in your game. So that's my first thing. And then try and think about, as a team, what kind of stuff you can actually act on. And I would try and only put in, like, when, jokingly, in the very first free-to-play game I ever worked on, my team didn't know anything about data, and they said, "What do you want me to track?" I said, "I want to track everything." Because I don't know what I want to look at, what's going to be important. So put in triggers, and so we built our own bespoke analytics tool because we were using our own game engine that the studio was in, and so there was a point where in the game, it was a game called Kumo Lumo. It was like a little cloud used to float about the world, raining on good things to make them grow, raining on bad things to make them go away. And there was a thing where, like, there was a whale that you would rain on, and then it would squirt water into you that recharges your battery. And we triggered, every drop of water that hit you was a triggered event. And we had, by accident, in our first week, 1 million players playing the game in the first week of launch. And you can imagine, say, 100,000 people all in America, all at the same time, all triggering thousands upon thousands of simultaneous events as the water was flowing into the cloud.
That's a lot of water droplets.
Yeah, our servers were not happy. They were not ready to scale for that level of data. And so you're much better off just thinking about things like that first time user experience, thinking about the key points you want to trigger, the key events that you would actually look at, the kinds of questions you might want to ask about the game, and a few that you might think you might want to get to a little bit later on. But it's by no means like that thing of I want to know everything in the data. That's going to make your lives much easier. The thing I find interesting is that this stuff exists in the free-to-play world, and it mostly exists in the free-to-play world because if players don't pay anything to play your game. So if you don't keep them in your game ecosystem playing your game, they're not likely to decide to spend money at some future point. So you're all about this kind of retention number, like the number one number everyone looks at when they're looking at free-to-play games is what's your retention like, what's your day 1, day 7, and day 40 and day 60 retention, so you can see you're keeping people in that ecosystem. So people are like, yeah, but I've already got money from people when they've bought the game, so why do I care on a paid game? You care because piece of analytics I did when I first started at Excalibur is I looked at our review score and I looked at how the review score affects sales. So your review score on Steam, if it drops below 70%, it will start to affect your conversion because other players are going to look at the game and go, game looks cool, what's everyone saying about it? Oh, everyone hates it, game must suck, I'm not going to buy it, right? If people stop, like people can get a full refund on the game up to the first hour, so your first hour has to be really good, so you want to be investing some analytics in that first hour to make sure people play long enough so they can't get a refund. If the second hour sucks, they can't get a refund and they hate your game. So then they're going to be really angry.
Better be sure they're going to leave a review. Yeah.
You're not going to start getting good reviews, depending on the style of game you're making, until hour 6 to 10.
Yeah.
So that means you need to make sure people have a really solid 10 hours of your game experience, so they're not likely to leave a negative review. And if they do, that's going to affect your review score. So that's what I would be looking at. Like as a PC developer, I'd be looking straight away, how do I make sure the first 10 hours of my game are really good? What data can I measure from that that's going to help me improve that experience for players?
Amazing. I mean, I'm just like, oh, it's all coming together. And now I feel really bad because, well, I don't think I've ever left a negative review, but I've also never left a positive review. So I feel like I really need to like do my duty as a person who plays games. And
between 2 and 5% of people leave reviews on games, negative or positive. And this is the thing again. This is why the analytics stuff's so important, because what you'll often find is the most vocal people who really love your game or really hate your game, are going to be engaged on your Discord servers, on your Steam forum, and on the reviews, and they're in varying levels. So the Discord servers are moderate. Steam discussion groups are less moderate, but moving towards extreme. And then the people who leave in reviews are extreme, right? I tell you some fun analysis on that I did with Simon Carlis a little while ago from a theory that he had as well. But on that extreme end, so what people often do is they look at the negative reviews and they're like, that's the stuff we need to fix. But that's probably 2% of your audience. And there's like 90% of your audience who are having a lovely time, who aren't commenting. And you can easily, by serving even a very very positive or very negative people disenfranchise the 90% of core audience as well. And your data will tell you, like this is where the data is important, is, oh, we're getting loads of reviews about this. What's the data telling us? Does the experience in game for the majority of players match what we're seeing? So do we need to, is this a like flashing red light that we need to fix now? Or we need to patch the updates super quick? Or is it actually just, we're here a certain kind of audience?
Yeah, totally. It makes sense. I mean, and actually, it really shows that you care about your, community as well as playing your game, by going that extra mile and making it easier for people to share their feedback in a very passive kind of way by just observing, those player actions and things like that. So. And
there's a second fun statistic tucked up in that. If you know between 2 and 5% of people leave reviews on the game, if you work that out at 5%, so you're estimating low, that means if you look at any game on Steam, you look at how many reviews it's got, stick a naught on the end and double it, that will tell you roughly how many units they've sold.
Right.
So you can really quickly, this is superpower for indie devs. I worked with loads of indie startups and students who are looking at forming their own teams. It's like when you want to, they'll go, oh, this game was super successful. You're like, was it? It's got 500 reviews. So how long did it take them to make it? How long, how much? So you can go really quickly. If a game's been out longer than 3 months and less than 2 years, you can go, okay, it's got 500 reviews. That means it's sold about 10,000 units.
Right.
They're selling it for $10. It's made about $100,000. 50% of that goes in Steam and returns and stuff. So they made $50,000 gross revenue. There was a team of 5 of them working on it for 2 years that probably made a whacking loss of about $200,000. So you can use the statistics as your superpower to understand which games are selling, which games aren't selling. In fact, you can also, using a similar stat that about 8% of people who wishlist a game follow a game, you can look at SteamDB, look at their upcoming games, you can look at how many followers they've got, and you can pre-forecast whether a game's going to sell or not even before it launches.
I feel like I'm playing 4D chess now. I feel like I have obtained a superpower, and I can't wait to go through Steam and now do all these like the meme with all the different numbers,
Yeah, exactly. You see through the matrix. Yeah.
Oh, Steve. Well, was there anything else you wanted to add, or?
Probably. What was there? Was a thing I said a second ago that I said, oh yeah, remind me, and we'll talk about it.
Oh, was it about reviews also, or?
Oh no, but I've got another one about reviews. I'll tell you another fun one. You can look at, the beautiful thing on Steam is, if anyone's got their Steam profile public, you can look at, part of the market research we do when we're trying to decide if a game should be signed or not, is we'll look at the people who've left reviews that have played the most hours on that game, and then look at what other games those people have played.
Yes.
So you can get a really nice sense of what their crossover games are. Oh, that was the fun one. I just remembered now. And then, so Simon Carlis, who runs Game Discover Co., he's another one of my friends I can nerd out about data with. He had a theory that the shorter the length of the review, the more casual the reviewer. So you can tell whether the majority of players of a game are serious or not about the game by the average length of the number of words they've got in their review. So I did that analysis, and it does seem to bear fruit. You can look at average play time and average duration of activity on Steam for players by the length of reviews they tend to leave and decide.
That's really cool.
Yeah, there's so much stuff.
Just these little things that you can, these little crumbs that you can pick up to develop these player profiles and things like that.
And I think that's the stuff I'm more interested in. I don't think traditional demographics play any role in players' play behaviour. There's the meme that goes around that King Charles and Ozzy Osbourne are the same age. Are they really the same gender? Are they really the same demographic?
Right.
And I think you're much better off thinking of players as the kinds of games they would play, the kinds of experience and motivations they have when they're playing those games, as you are about any of those other things.
Yeah, understanding people in their context, as opposed to the identifiers that traditional society uses.
Yeah, that have no bearing on what
No.
someone's actually like how they're likely to behave. And I think those sort of things, like looking at games, the kinds of reviews, what other games those people play, are a really good way of, again, helping you understand your audience. And if you understand your audience, you know what to look at in the data. And if you know what to look at in the data, you then know what to do in terms of human usability testing, see that, and draw all those threads together.
Oh, and I think that really sums up this whole conversation so well. Steve, thank you so much for being here today, and that concludes another episode of the Game Dev Local podcast. I've been your host, Laura Donohue, and you can find me online at LinkedIn at LJ Donohue. And just thank you so much again, Steve Stops, for being my guest today. And well, you found me on LinkedIn. I'm sure people can probably find you there.
It's the only place I exist online. Otherwise, find me in physical realm. But
Yeah.
Normally at events and things. But yeah, thank you so much for having me and letting me know about data.
Yay! Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. Bye bye.